Hi, I'm Ernie Conover. Welcome to my shop. Today I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about scrapers, which is a whole class of turning tools. They are a somewhat misunderstood tool. I think there's a wide swath of the turning community that really doesn't understand how they work and may even think that they're lesser of a turner if they use a scraper. Nothing could be further from the truth. They are a tool which will get the job done when no other tool will work. They save the day often. The difficulty starts in the learning to turn scenario after you've been told with gouges and skews to rub the bevel on the work and to use a high angle of attack and a very sharp edge to create a definite chip with a positive angle cut. Suddenly scrapers are introduced and you have to go from holding the tool like this on the wrist to putting it on the wrist like this and holding it downhill on the wrist and actually dragging it against the work like this. And it is this burr on the edge that you created during grinding or a process called burnishing that creates that burr and makes this cut very efficiently. It doesn't take an awful lot off with each pass, and that's its strength actually. You're limited to the length of that burr to how much material you can remove, but that means it doesn't dig in like a gouge or a skew would when it goes against the grain. So they tend to do a little better against the grain, and again, on undercuts, on getting to places that you can't get to with the other tools, these carry the day. They come in a wide variety of forms, from dome scrapers like this for bowl turning. Some of them have an edge just on one side or the other. And they come in a wide variety, but I like the plain old what's called a dome scraper, where you just make this a half round here. A tool similar to that is this, what I call a boat tail scraper. And this has a straight edge right across here with a little 15-degree rake on the end of it like the tail of a boat would. And it has a round radius on this edge. And it's for flattening platters and tabletops when you're turning. And you can start in the center and drag that across the work. And that straight edge will cut a level surface. By having that little kick in the end of it, it won't leave a line behind it, which the rear corner would, and you had perfect alignment. And the radius allows it to cut to the left. Pretty handy tool. This is a V scraper, which I probably use more than any other scraper in the arsenal. And it is most useful for doing chucking, whether you're using a metal chuck and creating a recess for the chuck to grab, or you're making wood chucks, which are called jam chucks. Any decent chunk of steel will actually make a pretty good scraper. And it doesn't even need to be particularly hard for a very short job. A good example are screwdrivers. Actually will make pretty decent scrapers. I needed to get around a corner inside of a vessel one time, and I improvised this on the spot. I bent it with a torch and I ground the edge to a radius like that, and I could reach back in around it, get behind and scrape out fine. I only needed it for a few minutes. Here's a very nice little round nose scraper I made out of a Chinese chisel. Works great. Here's one that I use for turning boxes, for doing the inside of boxes. That's an old plow plane blade that I ground into a scraper. here's an old Mortise chisel I ground into a scraper, and this one is for reaching back around and putting a little chucking recess when you want to turn a bowl for the second time. Here's a bigger version of that tool. I can reach behind like that, tip it downhill, go in and scrape a chucking recess when it's gone out of round during the drying process. So very handy scraper. That's a piece of high-speed steel that I had on hand. Here's another screwdriver that I ground into a little scraper, and this allows me to make a little captive bead on miniature wine cups that I turn, and I can go in from one side and catch that bead on one side and the other and make a little, separate a little captive bead on the turning. Here's two different scrapers I made out of old files. These days it seems that files are rather scoffed on for use as a scraper, and yet we use them all the time. In my youth, we could buy them for 50 cents to $1 a pound used files. So they made great turning tools. I think why people are a bit afraid of them is that a file is very hard. It's 63, 64, and it will snap if you put too much bending force on it. And so if you try to use it uphill, which a lot of beginners will do, yeah, it could snap, especially too if you were extending it a long way off the rest. But if they're used downhill, as they're supposed to be, a scraper actually just pivots and goes out of trouble for the most part. If you want to really be safe about that, just take it in to the house someday when your wife is off shopping somewhere and heat her oven up to about 475 degrees and stick your files that you're going to make into scrapers in that oven and let them go right up to temperature for 20 minutes to an hour, doesn't matter much. Turn the oven off and forget it. Take the files out, and they're now brought down to about 55 Rockwell, and they're not going to snap nearly as easily. There are two ways to sharpen a scraper, and to understand the two ways, we really have to understand sort of the history of scrapers. The tool is very much akin to a cabinet making scraper, which is often called a card scraper, and it's just a rectangular piece of steel about 1/16 of an inch thick, or even thinner these days. And you can burnish this to a burr on the edge, and you do this with a round burnish that is put with some force over the edge, and it will actually upset the metal and cause it to roll up into a burr. The tool is then used by flexing it slightly and pushing it forward on the work, and it will smooth figured wood like curly maple without ripping the curls out. So was often used after planes had been put across the curls where they won't tear out, but if you try to go with the grain with a plane and curly maple, it usually spells disaster. So they would go to scrapers to finish that, and finally sandpaper. So with that in mind, these scrapers were hardened to about 55 Rockwell, well, where a normal chisel or a turning tool is hardened to about 58 to 62 Rockwell, somewhere, depends on the manufacturer, the alloy they're using. But with carbon steel tools, that was the norm. But scrapers were sent from the manufacturer in the day at 55 Rockwell. And you could simply grind them to the shape you want, take an oil stone, clean it all off. We'll show that in a few minutes. And then burnish it with a hand burnish. Worked well. Well, in the late 70s, high-speed steel came along, and suddenly turners had this fantastic steel that you couldn't burn in the grinder. You could just grind burrs on this and they'd last longer than a one that you burnished in normal steel. So they really took off, and high-speed steel is even harder than carbon steel. You can get it up to as high as 68 these days, but you certainly get it to 64, 65 Rockwell without much problem. And so it is harder than the burnish. So burnishing was kind of out the window. Fortunately, Veritas has come along with a super burnishing jig that has tungsten carbide cones. We'll show you that in a second and how that works. But to grind a scraper is probably the first way that you can sharpen it, and you can just dispense with burnishing and simply grind these to the shape and edge you want and use them just fine. You want to just take a platform rest like this, make it a little uphill so you're putting about a 15-degree slope in that wall, and you simply rotate this against the grinder like that, and it will put a great edge on here through a process called plastic deformation, and the metal actually becomes plastic because of the heat of grinding, and it burrs up there and leaves a burr. And of course, in all our turning tools, we spend all our time with hones and buffers trying to get rid of that burr, but here we want it. It's our friend. And by dragging it downhill, that burr is very short. It can only take off a little at a time, a few thousandths. So it's limited in its attack, and it doesn't cut away material very fast, but it'll do it without ripping the curls out of curly maple or anytime you're going against the grain. To sharpen it, we'd simply start this grinder up, touch it down, and grind it. And you can see here I've got a nice grind that's gone all the way around that edge. And I'll show you how we take this over and burnish it in a second. All right, we have our freshly ground scraper here, and if we had burnished this, we can't burnish it a second time without removing some of this metal around here by grinding. That's because metal will work hard by simply compacting it, either through pounding or burnishing. It will harden. And if you've ever done any metal spinning, you often have to anneal the metal periodically, or it will split during the spinning process. At any rate, we now have ground this, and we grind away by doing what we just did at the wheel. We've ground away the work hardened area, and I have a simple India oil stone here. I'm just going to put a little kerosene on. And if you're limited space, you can actually do this right up on the headstock of the lathe. I'm just going to take that and actually remove every bit of that burr around here. And then I'm going to take this and I'm touching here and at the heel of the bevel like that. There. And if you can see, I've got a bright spot right at the edge, right there. And by using the oil stone like that, I've brought that to a perfectly faired curve. It doesn't have any irregularity out to it. I'll do that again. And now I'll simply go over to the burnishing jig and burnish it. I'll show you how that works now. now that we have refined this edge to two planes which meet perfectly by the use of stones, we'll come over here to this Veritas Burnishing Jig. It's really a great tool, and it needs to be mounted on a bench, or I have it on a platform here. It has a fulcrum point right here, which can be moved. You can put it in two different places depending on the size of the tool. And it has this tungsten carbide cone. It comes with two cones. This one's steeper than that, which will give you a slightly different angle on your burr. I find this one works very well for me. To use it, I simply put my hip against the tool and put a fair amount of pressure on it. And using that fulcrum pin, I just put a fair amount of side pressure as I come through there. And now I'll switch to the other side like this. Again, leaning on it, I will go right down like that and then back. And I'm left with a heck of a good burr, which I think works better for bowl turning with these big scrapers. For small form scrapers, it's so hard to get them in here that grinding works as well. Also, you don't tend to use that kind of scraper as long as you use this type of one. All right, it's now time to see these scrapers in use. Let's start with this little chucking scraper. It's got a lot of useful things that you can do with it. One, if you want to just put a little V-groove in something, it'll do a beautiful job of that. So it's wonderful for little accents and things like that. And it would also come over here on the end of this and make a nice shoulder. And we could chamfer that shoulder and go all over it. But you notice I'm always very careful that this is downhill when I place it. It'll cut end grain right here better than blank grain without being downhill. You can get away with it here. But often in a bowl, I'll actually tilt that scraper so that even this edge is coming. You can also make form scrapers. Here's one I made to make a decorative detail. And I'm rocking that back and forth about a 32nd of an inch to keep it having some clearance. There I've made two beads side by side to create that shape. We have our freshly burnished dome scraper here with a Greek burr on it, downhill like this. And you can see this is more for bowl work than spindle work, but you can see that it will remove material very nicely with a pretty decent surface finish. It'll never be as good as you'll get with a edge tool like a gouge or a skew, but in faceplate work you have to go against the grain twice a revolution. So it isn't if you sand, it's how much you have to sand. So scrapers really carry the day in faceplate work in the final shaping. In spindle work, they're more for chucking and for doing forms, things like that. In bowl work, I will actually hold them kind of like a pencil, and inertia, it being pretty heavy, is your friend. And I'll put it downhill like this. And there it is. You also have to play around and find the right angle for your burr. And you can see it's cutting much nicer now without acting up nearly as much. And I dare say the surface finish has improved dramatically, and really that isn't a bad finish at all. We could sand that with probably starting with 180 do just fine. So I don't manhandle this tool. I'm holding this very gently like a fountain pen almost, and I'm holding it here and I'm using it with light touch. And that is the important thing to remember about scrapers. Now when I go inside a bowl, I'll actually, as I come up the wall of the bowl, I will tip it, and like that. So this has been my take on scrapers, what I've gained and experienced over a long turning career. I'd also add that they're ephemeral tools that you grind them to a shape and then you often regrind them to another shape with the needs of what you're doing. You grind them up, you throw them away, you get another blank of steel, and you make another one. They're the epitome of what an accountant in a machine tool company calls perishable tooling. It's stuff that gets used up and amortized fast. So thanks for visiting my shop. I appreciate your being here.